Hi, Katie. It's Stephanie. I have made you a co-host, and I'll watch for the others to join, and I'll make them a co-host as well so they can share their screens today.
Great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Good afternoon. My name is Eric Blank, and this is a commissioner's information meeting in proceeding number 25I-0418, outreach and other analysis with large customers in Colorado. Commissioner Gilman, Commissioner Plant, any preliminary remarks? Are you ready to jump into it?
No, happy to have our staff joining us to present this information and really look forward to engaging with you all in a discussion about what you found.
Commissioner Plant.
Yeah, ready to jump on in. Thanks.
Ms. Mulvaney, what'd you find?
All right. Good afternoon, commissioners. Thanks, Chair Blank. My name is Katie Mulvaney of Research and Emerging Issues, and today I'm joined by Stephen Dalkey of trial staff, who will be helping me present. And we're also joined by our colleague Jeff Fiedler, also of trial staff, to help us answer any questions that you have. And as you said, we are going to be presenting the findings from staff's initial outreach to large load customers as part of the investigatory docket 25I-0418E. Just a bit of background to remind you what this iDocket is about. So large load customers have been reaching out to the Commission with concerns that utility and regulatory processes are not compatible with the needs of large load customers and the economic development community. So as a result, the Commission initiated this iDocket. The purpose of staff's initial work was focused on gathering feedback from these large load customers. The decision also directed staff to gather information that's relevant for PSCo's large load tariff filing, which is ordered to be filed early in 2026. Staff was required to file at least one report within 60 days of the decision, which we filed in the docket last week. And this presentation is going to bring you up to speed on what we found. So to start off with an overview on what we'll cover today, I'm going to start us off with key takeaways and also some introductory information, followed by the customer perspectives that we heard on large load tariff design. I'm then going to move us into the customer's experience with utilities in Colorado. I'm going to cover Black Hills, and then I will pass it off to Stephen Dalkey to talk about PSCo, a few other related topics that we heard from large customers, and then he will conclude. So starting us off with key takeaways, I'm going to begin with findings on what customers told us about large load tariff design. So first of all, overall, customers are concerned about uncertainty on the tariff, as well as corresponding interconnection delays and generation constraints in Colorado. In the decision opening the iDocket, the Commission asked that we specifically examine demand response and load flexibility options related to large customers. And we heard from many of them that flexibility was an option, but they just noted that different types of large load have differing capabilities. Customers also noted that they would really like to see a bring your own generation option in the tariff. And finally, we found that large load customers generally support financial commitments to provide certainty to load forecasts and also remove speculative loads from the interconnection queue. We also wanted to highlight some of staff's conclusions from talking with PSCo, their customers, and also conducting an audit of their interconnection processes. We found that PSCo is having significant delays in its large load interconnection queue process, especially in its system impact study phase. And I'll discuss the full interconnection process in the introduction, but given the sequence of this process, delays in the SIS phase also holds up signed energy service agreements. We found overall that customers were concerned by PSCo's communication and customer service, and this checked out in our conversation with PSCo and also in the audit we conducted. And so as a result, the Commission may want to consider some reporting requirements with the aim of improving customer service and accountability. So before diving into the details, I'll cover some information to the extent we're able on who it was that we talked with. I'll talk about the landscape of large load customers in Colorado, the role that large loads play in economic development in the state, and I'm also going to outline the steps of the interconnection queue process, since that's a focus of our findings. So first of all, who did we talk with? So confidentiality was really paramount to this work. And so in our reporting, we are prioritizing the anonymity and confidentiality of the customers. What I can say is that we talked to representatives from 13 companies and organizations, and they covered a wide spectrum of customers as well as load size, covering tens of megawatts to nearly 1,000 megawatts. The interviewees we spoke with were both prospective and existing customers. They covered many different industries, not just the data center industry. Some interviewees were from individual companies. Others were from organizations that represent the interests of multiple customers. And our interviewees were in varying stages of the interconnection process. So some were waiting on the system impact study, some were waiting on a facility study, and some had already signed an ESA. In general, the interviews lasted for about 60 minutes, and we asked about information to help us understand the company's business, what their perspective was on large load tariffs, and finally what their experience was with Colorado utilities. Given headlines that focus so much on data centers, we wanted to provide a reminder and an overview on what large loads look like in Colorado. So we have existing customers, and they tend to be in the range of tens of megawatts, hundreds of megawatts. Their load needs can vary, and they can be quite different from a data center, especially in terms of load profile. Some are not actually growing their demand, but others are seeking to increase their demand. And some need to increase their demand as a result of some state statutory emissions targets. And many are critical to the economic health and development of the state. There are also many data center customers that already take service in Colorado, and others that are wanting to establish a presence here. And they span the size range from tens of megawatts to nearly a gigawatt. The track record and also the business models of data center customers can vary quite a bit. Some are solely developers, so they're just working on site development, and they will sell or pass off the site to a data center operator. Others are involved in the full life cycle from site development all the way up to data center operations, where they might lease out space to clients. Some of these companies are brand new and have just formed, and others are industry veterans. Our interviews also included some discussion on the importance of large loads to economic development in Colorado. And this was also the topic of some of the public comments the Commission received prior to opening this iDocket, so we just wanted to emphasize it here. So new large loads are important because they can bring in high levels of local property tax revenue. And that expected revenue is then used by local governments, developers, and also special districts to underwrite municipal bonds that build infrastructure, not just for the data centers, but also for utilities and services that make a newly developed area livable. And this is especially true for the Aurora area. For example, JTS public comment noted that there's 2 data centers totaling about a gigawatt of expected load that are helping to anchor the new Aurora Highlands development. So the key point here is just that the ability to plan for large loads affects not just electricity bills, but many other facets of life for new communities. The final topic I'll cover in the introduction here is just to lay the foundation of what exactly are the steps of an interconnection queue process. And so I'm going to go over the information that's provided in PSCo's open access transmission tariff. So the first step is that a customer submits a transmission system interconnection request. Next, PSCo and the customer typically enter into a system impact study agreement, or SIS, and the customer pays a fee. And the purpose of that SIS is to identify system constraints and also transmission upgrades that may be needed at a high level. And the results can include a cost estimate. The next step, again, typically, is that the PSCO and the customer enter into a facility study agreement, and the customer pays another fee. And the purpose of the facility study is to provide the customer with some more detail on the cost of those upgrades, and it also usually includes a time frame over which the utility can complete those upgrades. And finally, the customer and PSCO will enter into interconnection and energy services agreements. So now I'll move into our findings from our conversations with large load customers. Start off with customer perspectives on large load tariff design. So staff asked customers in interviews what tariff provisions they found acceptable or have seen work well in other states. And staff also asked what sorts of tariff provisions were non-starters for customers. A topic where customers had a lot of thoughts to share was on interconnection queues for large loads that would be subject to a tariff. So the list shown here is a summary of what we heard could work to help improve the process. And one tactic that came up fairly frequently in about half of our conversations was the idea that I shared in our key takeaways that a financial commitment could be used to help streamline the queue, remove speculative customers, and provide more certainty to load forecasts. Another set of suggestions involved providing some evidence that load would show up, which could include looking at a developer's track record of bringing large loads online, providing proof of land ownership, or looking at whether the customer has brought other facilities online within the service territory. Some customers suggested that those subject to Colorado statutory emissions targets could perhaps be given some prioritization. And finally, customers suggested considering beneficial aspects of the site itself for prioritization, like proximity to transmission or generation capacity, for example. When it came to provisions of the tariff itself, customers provided feedback on many dimensions of tariff design. First, many noted that they expected upfront costs, but that they have to be a reasonable order of magnitude. I'll go over Tri-State's tariff in a couple slides to provide a little context here. Second, customers also wanted to have available multiple options for meeting any security or collateral requirements. So that might look like offering both a parental guarantee or a letter of credit to meet that security obligation. We also heard that customers prefer to enter into long-term contracts. As I mentioned in the key takeaways, several customers are hoping to have a pathway to bring your own generation option for both behind the meter and front of the meter generation. And finally, customers were accepting of minimum demand provisions, but we heard from several that demand clawback provisions were unacceptable. And so demand clawback is where utilities would have the capability to reduce a customer's contracted demand under various circumstances. Last few points on large load tariffs. So I've already mentioned in the key takeaways that customers are open to flexibility, and we have heard that they are discussing it with utilities in other states. But not all large customers have equal capabilities when it comes to flexibility. Something else we heard is that customers would prefer a mechanism that would monetize their flexibility services. Regardless of the final tariff form, several customers noted that they would prefer to see some consistency in large load processes across jurisdictions. And finally, we wanted to highlight a perspective that actually came from existing customers. So some are concerned that they will end up subsidizing new large loads. And this is similar to the concern that large load costs will impact residential customers. And some suggested that a separate customer class for new large loads could help address these cost allocation concerns. We spoke with Tri-State about their high impact load tariff and included this in the report as an example of a tariff that might be active in Colorado soon, even though the PUC doesn't regulate Tri-State's rates and tariffs. And the thing that we wanted to emphasize here was the minimum security requirement. So Tri-State requires $2.7 million per megawatt for its security, they ask that 25% of the deposit is due when Tri-State files its Phase 2 resource plan with the Colorado Commission. And then the remainder is due once the Commission approves the plan. A few customers we talked with noted that $2.7 million per megawatt is quite high for a security requirement, but distribution co-op members of Tri-State do have the option to work with their customers to reduce that through Tri-State's Bring Your Own resource tariff. So that is all that we have on large load tariff design. You are welcome to jump in whenever you'd like with questions, but did you want me to pause here for any questions or discussion?
Commissioner Gilman.
I mean, I'm fine to do a discussion at the end. I mean, I can do it either way, depending how y'all want to structure it.
Do you have a preference, Ms. Mulvaney?
I think we can keep rolling and save it for the end. That works for us.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, great. So I am going to move us into the next major section of our presentation, and that's focused on the large load customer experience with regulated utilities in Colorado. So in addition to the interviews that we did with large customers, we also spoke with Black Hills and PSCo just to provide a more well-rounded view of what's going on. So I'll discuss Black Hills, and then I will pass it off to Stephen to talk about PSCo. And before I start, I just want to note that the information on this slide is based on significantly fewer conversations compared to the information we gathered on tariffs and the customer experience with PSCo. But overall, customers report that Black Hills is responsive to inquiries. They also note that service is reliable, but customers do see Black Hills rates as relatively high. Black Hills told us that they are receiving inquiries on large loads in Colorado, but they worry about the obstacles that they see presented by Colorado's resource planning requirements and emissions targets, and that impacts their ability to bring these large loads online. And ideally, Black Hills would like to replicate their successful Wyoming large load tariff to the extent that would be possible in Colorado. So that tariff is called the Large Power Contract Service Tariff, and it's applicable to customers 5 megawatts and larger. And we present it here because it includes several desired features that were mentioned by customers in the previous section, and it also builds in some ratepayer protections. So the tariff states that costs from generation and transmission are assigned directly to customers, and that resources must cover the load's need plus planning reserve margin. Costs from these large customers are separated from other retail customers in the class cost of service studies, and that's stated directly in the tariff. Additionally, the tariff allows for multiple forms of credit support and also has a bring your own generation option. And with that, I will turn it over to Stephen to discuss PSCo.
Great. Thank you, Katie. I'm going to try something quick. Let's see if I can take the screen from you. You all see the slide, slide 21 here on your screens?
We can.
Cool. Thanks so much, Katie. I appreciate the handoff here. So yeah, I'm gonna Katie gave us kind of the overview, high level takeaways, and some of the experiences and perspectives we heard from our interviews with prospective customers in regulated service territories. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the experience with PSCo, as well as the results of some discovery and audit we conducted to try and understand where things are at with the large load interconnection process. So let me see if I can, oh, 1 second here. All right. Katie referred to this at a high level in the key takeaways. But early on in this outreach, we started to hear some patterns across different customers experiencing some concerns and impacts just related to think I'm on the wrong slide. Apologize here. Maybe it would have been better to let Katie keep driving. Here we go. All right. I think I got a handle on this now. Yes. Okay. So we were hearing some of these patterns from our interviews early on that continued throughout the outreach with customers. Customers experiencing delays in the interconnection process. I'll kind of explain a little more precisely what we mean by delays here. Exacerbated with some communication challenges and just general uncertainty over where they're at in the processing of their applications. Katie noted, and we were kind of investigating further, a few customers that were more proactively thinking about behind the meter or bring your own generation or kind of pay for your own infrastructure arrangements, thinking that could help ease some of the challenges in the backlogs. And those who more proactively explored those options, we heard a few examples of customers running into just kind of a wall or not having success moving those forward. When a large industrial customer or a very large prospective commercial customer gets referred to by the utility to the small business net energy metering program, that didn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. And we were kind of hearing just a lack of process or lack of option for what they were trying to do here. And again, we'll talk through this. This is all kind of new ground that folks are trying to forge here. So some of that is just trying to figure out what programs or processes make sense for customers that have these interests. But in general, after we started hearing some of this feedback, we went ahead and issued some discovery to PSCo to try and get a more comprehensive handle and viewpoint on what's going on. Informed by those earlier conversations, we focused a lot of these questions just around trying to understand. We're calling it the large load interconnection queue. I think that's an appropriate term here. There's a lot of parallels to the generation queue. But so basically, Katie outlined the process earlier, but we asked for essentially a data dump from PSCo on all of the new large load applications that they received over the past 3 years from the date of when we asked the questions. All the applications, all of the timelines, the study agreements, the statuses of each of these customers, studies themselves to the extent that, for the customers who were progressing and had studies completed through the facility studies and the energy supply agreement discussions. What we found, and this was perfectly consistent with a lot of the conversations we were having, was many of the applicants were stuck in the system impact study stage. Not all of them. We kind of enumerate the state of the large load interconnection queue, if you will, on that bottom slide with all the sub-bullets. But we found from this audit, essentially, with 37 large load interconnection requests, applications submitted by prospective new loads, totaling 16.1 gigawatts of ramp on various timelines. 19 of those, so a little over half are stuck in the system impact study stage, and then the rest are kind of they've either withdrawn or there's a small amount in a few other stages of the process. As of about a month ago, or a little over a month ago, when we received this data. I will note these numbers. This is it. It's a low bar to get an application in. You have to fill out some basic information and send it to the utility about your prospective load. Size, load ramps, location, general timing, but there's not, there's either zero cost or it's a very minimal cost to get an application into this queue at this time. So that kind of characterizes, these numbers that you see on the screen here. And some of the concerns are basically not moving forward and not having a sense of what's going on or confidence in the, the resolution or the roadmap, essentially, of this process. It was interesting. I was kind of expecting when we were doing this outreach, a lot of the discussion to focus around getting certainty or paths to generation and supply adequacy for these new customers. And when we started asking them open-ended questions about their experience, the large majority of the time was really focused on these Q studies that they were having challenges with. So as I noted on the last slide, about a little over half of the customers in the queue at this time are in the system impact study phase. That means that they have submitted their application. The utility, the transmission provider Xcel or PSCo, has determined that their prospective load would likely have an impact on the system, triggering a need for a system impact study. And so what they do is they sign a system impact study agreement. It's a contract or a written agreement that both parties sign. It specifies kind of the high level parameters of the study, specifies the key inputs to the study, specifies the timeline for which the utility or Xcel will deliver the study, and then it specifies the terms of payment. So the customer, upon signing these agreements, is required to pay PSCo the cost to conduct the study. So there's a nominal fee associated with it. And then they have due dates. So most of the agreements that we looked at for these customers specify system impact study report delivery in 4 months from payment. And more recently, the system impact studies have been doing these with a 6-month due date from payment. And this is what I think for the most part are talking about when we're talking about delays. So these agreements are signed, payments are made, and then the 4 months or 6 months pass and the study's not delivered and the customers are left kind of not hearing and having some issues with figuring out where they're at or where this is going. So of the 19 that are in this system impact study stage, these last sub bullets on this slide, 10 of them have been waiting 6 to 12 months, and 4 of them have been waiting over a year for the system impact studies. We found one applicant who received a system impact study report on time being on or before the date specified in the system impact study agreement. We weren't seeing instances of revised timelines when due dates were passed. And that was kind of perhaps behind some of the frustrations or the challenges the customers were experiencing, is not getting kind of new updates in the way that they would maybe expect when these studies fall behind. We were told that they had completed 7 system impact studies out of the 37 I originally referred to, but they could only provide us with 3 of them that we were able to view and obtain. We asked kind of why we couldn't get all of them, and the manager at PSCo, who was kind of responsible for gathering all this, told us that the others were kind of owned by other employees who had left the company in the meantime, and that was the reason they provided for not giving us the full set of studies that we asked for. I want to briefly, I won't read through all this, but this is, I wanted to quote some of the relevant pieces in the Public Services Open Access Transmission Tariff. It's on file with FERC, specifying their non-discriminatory and open access kind of transmission service obligations, specifically the part relating to large network load customer interconnections to this system that kind of specify the queue process that we currently have. Can you guys see the whole thing, or is it getting cut off on your screens like it is on mine?
A little bit cut off on the right.
Yeah, I saw that too. All right, let's go with this for now.
Yeah, that works.
Yeah, so these are some direct quotes from the tariff that's on file with FERC, stating that the transmission provider, PSCo in this case, is to use due diligence to complete system impact studies within the 60-day period. And then immediately after that in the tariff, there's a clause stating that if they can't meet that timeline, the utility will notify the prospective load, provide a new estimated completion date along with an explanation of the reasons for why additional time is required to complete this study. So first off, it's clear the 60-day timeline that is listed in their tariff appears overly optimistic these days, given that the agreements that they're signing at the beginning are already, specifying timelines of 4 months to do the study, and now in 2025, 6 months. But then, the other part of this was the communication piece and the notification obligations that are written in the tariff that kind of stood out to us a little bit, and that's why we asked a little bit more about the communication around some of these delays. So in addition to all of the studies and the agreements, we asked for documentation of their communication to customers when delays are experienced. We had heard just anecdotally mixed reviews, in our interviews from customers, not hearing back, them reaching out, kind of maybe hearing back a little bit, but not getting satisfactory responses. That was the perspectives we were receiving from a handful of customers in our interviews. So we asked PSCo to show us, how they're communicating with these customers when delays occur. And the utility, PSCo, wasn't able to provide us documentation of the communication when these studies became overdue. They did tell us that the company does directly communicate with customers when delays in these studies occur, but that the company does not readily track these communications in response to the relevant discovery request on this topic. And so we didn't see any, we weren't able to kind of inspect that aspect of it. So that's kind of the biggest challenge, concern, choke point, if you will, in this queue, is really these customers that are in the system impact study stage. We did, as Katie mentioned, we did talk to PSCo, their team, folks who manage this queue, the people who conduct the study, the people who are assigned to interface with customers, as well as the leadership at the utility who kind of have responsibility for this area of their business. And they gave us the perspective on some of these challenges that we're outlining. One, just being that this is an unprecedented level of applicants that they've received in the last few years. Typically, like I think, in the 20 teens and so on, historically, they may get a couple large load applications per year that they need to study and look at. And you saw the numbers already. It's about an order of magnitude higher than that, the rate at which they're receiving applications, as well as staffing challenges they explained to us, including turnover, where employees who had load queue responsibilities left for various reasons, including some who went to data center companies, as well as just general shortages on employees and folks who are able to do these studies. And PSCo did indicate to us that they are working with or have engaged a consulting engineering firm to help with the load for conducting these system impact studies. They mentioned obligation to serve, and in that perspective, potentially causing challenges with processing all applicants on a non-discriminatory basis, even though some may be more speculative than others. They noted a range of applicant sophistication in terms of their experience with the process, their understanding of interconnection electrical systems, and some instances they noted of changing study baselines. So that would be a case where the way it was described to us is they get an application, they have a system impact study agreement that specifies a load ramp, for example, and then later, after that study has kicked off, the prospective customer comes back and says, actually, the load ramp is this, right? Things have changed, the market's changed, whatever. And from the utility's perspective, that could have to restart the process. The way it was described, it feels like, this isn't super specified in the process, but it feels like things are being processed kind of in a first in, first out kind of, queue order. And when these kinds of things happen, they potentially have to kind of go back and restart the study, potentially putting everyone after them continuing on hold and exacerbating challenges. Some of the concerns and challenges we had kind of in response to this perspective is from one end, it's understanding, right? Like we're in a place where this the industry hasn't, these are a lot, an order of magnitude larger number of applicants, lots of requests to process. So that's totally understandable. The thing that we found kind of challenging to wrap our heads around was we didn't see when, if and when these things happened, we didn't see that come through in the study agreements or the process or the communications. As I mentioned, we didn't see any of the communication occurring between the utility and the customer when these studies become overdue. One way this could be handled is you revise study agreements, right? When the due dates have passed or when key study parameters needed to be changed. The utility was telling us this was happening and was one of the challenges. We didn't see any of that in the agreements that we received when we requested them. So not an agreement that then gets revised. It's just an agreement with the due date. That date passes, and for these or whatever reasons, it's still not done. And there's a lot of applicants that are still kind of in that stage today. So that kind of wraps it up. Since we're just rolling and we'll have a discussion in a second here, I'll just really briefly mention this DOE and FERC ANOPR. The reason is not that we engaged on this or did a whole lot, but this came up throughout the course of our investigation. You may be familiar with the Secretary of Energy sending a letter to FERC commissioners requesting them open a NOPR, a notice of proposed rulemaking. The reason we just wanted to at least have this for reference in here is because, as I mentioned, this load interconnection process is laid out and specified in the FERC-approved open access transmission tariff. I showed you some relevant quotes from that tariff earlier. And it feels like potentially, some of the challenges with this queue and these study processes that I just described that we're experiencing here, it could be that that there's challenges like this across the nation, and that could be part of why DOE and FERC are thinking about maybe doing something on this topic. And if they do, it potentially could impact the queue process that we just outlined and that we kind of talked through what's going on in Colorado. So we didn't go deep. We didn't think about engaging in this at any point now, but it's just something from our perspective to keep an eye on because it could impact processes that are relevant to what we're talking about here. And this is just some reference on the latest timeline of that FERC thing. And then wrapping up, that's all we have. I'm not going to read through these. These are kind of a shorter way of explaining the key takeaways that Katie mentioned at the beginning. We talked through all of these takeaways, but maybe I'll leave them up for a minute while I thank you for your time and tell you that this is the end of our formal presentation for this section. Maybe I'll turn it back over to Katie or open it up to you all, commissioners.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in with a couple questions. I mean, I get that things are delayed because, the number of customers increased by a factor of 10, but it just seems like we're seeing communication problems that exist elsewhere. And I guess my question to you guys is some of the problem just a lack of standardized process. You don't know when things are complete. And it just seems like there's also a lack of maybe reporting and tracking. So just any thoughts on how, what they should be doing to improve communication and managing expectations better?
Yeah, thanks. I can start, and then we have Jeff Fiedler on the line too, who was involved in a lot of these, and he may have some thoughts. Jeff, you don't have to respond, but I just wanted to invite you to if you want to add to anything. But yeah, I think, Chairman, we that's, I think, a right diagnosis. There's some process that has been spelled out in the tariff around how these studies are to proceed. And in general, that process has just been completely overwhelmed. It's not, but on the same side, there's some process. To some extent, it's not being followed very well in terms of the notification, the communication obligations. You know, for whatever reason, we can't meet this deadline. We didn't see, you know, what would you would the tariff seemed to suggest there should be, you know, follow up on how to you know, where this is going next, what the new deadline is, what the reason is for these delays, and so on. So that's kind of getting to the lack of communication. But I do think wherever it comes from, some additional thinking around if there needs to be additional requirements specified in that process, or I think we referred to it here in some of the key takeaways. I think potentially even from the commission's perspective, some requirements for reporting as one of the next steps you could consider as potentially low-hanging fruit. You know, I think like the set of questions we asked on this to get this initial set of insights that we summarized for you today, something like that on an ongoing basis could be considered for, you know, just to shine a light on what's going on here. There could be consideration on what the appropriate cadence is. I know when there was, we were chatting with some folks who went through this historically on the generation queue side when things were kind of new and in like some of the initial years when things were really delayed. I think there were reporting requirements, and they were kind of more frequently until things seemed to get better, and then it kind of the cadence was maybe slowed down a little bit or less frequently. So all those things could be considered here on the load side as well. But yeah, I mean, I think those are a good set of questions to think through.
Can I hop in and add? I think one thing, Stephen, I'm not sure if I heard you say. I think just from like our audit responses, it seemed like the company really needs to think about a more structured customer relations management software or program, like just some ability to track when there is a contact, what was discussed in that meeting, what the follow-ups were. Right now, again, from our audit information that we got back, it doesn't seem like they're able to do that. And yes, there's been you know, staff turnover as happens, but you would think with something as important as this large load queue that there would be a way to, you know, hand that off, you know, even with some amount of employee turnover. So yeah, just a finding. But yeah, so I think to summarize, like some kind of more structured customer relation management and tracking approach. And then the other thing, you know, I mean, I think there is, you know, a sort of systemic problem here that these things are coming faster, and the business environment of the data centers and large loads sort of requires a nimbleness. So I think some exploration of like cluster studies or some way to sort of streamline and get the interconnection study approach more nimble would be helpful. Because I think as Stephen was saying, if you just keep doing everything like in a very rigid order, anytime anything changes, it just seemed to create a little bit of disorder in how they were handling, and you know, to do sort of static interconnection studies or system impact studies on a dynamic, you know, business requirement, and you know, the grid itself is dynamic. It just seemed like they were getting caught in a very you know, unresponsive way of doing these studies that wasn't meeting the volume they were getting.
Katie, anything, or Stephen, anything you want to add? I have one more question, and maybe I'll turn it over to my colleagues and conclude with my last question. But go ahead, Katie, anything you want to add?
I don't have anything to add. I just wanted to say I agree with the assessments Stephen and Jeff gave.
Okay. This may be a Ms. O'Neill question, but from a high level perspective, it just seems like there's a lot of customer issues arising with public service company. It sounds like the staff customer service report found complaints have maybe doubled, customer satisfaction has declined. waiting times for smaller customers that call on the phone, as well as bit billing problems have significantly increased. We're having more and longer outages, even accounting for extreme weather. And we're hearing similar customer service concerns from intermediate sized customers. So I guess, I don't know who this is directed to, maybe Ms. O'Neill, but do you have a sense of what's going on? Is this a result of misaligned financial incentives that have led to O&M cuts and staff turnover? Or is there a leadership or cultural problem? Do you think these problems are unrelated, related? So I don't know, Dr. Dalkey, Ms. O'Neill, thoughts on that?
Ms. O'Neill, there you are.
Yeah. So I can take a stab at this from my perspective, and then turn it over to Stephen and Jeff and Katie and see if they have any other thoughts. And I think, Chairman, you're referencing some of the. And sorry, for the record, I'm Erin O'Neill. I'm Deputy Director for the Public Utilities Commission, and I think you're referencing some of the other investigations that staff has conducted this year into the company's increased outage on the distribution system and customer service problems with and billing problems that are sort of subjects of other proceedings, but have all kind of landed to trial staff and the commission to do some investigations and bring reports back to the commission, all of which have highlighted particular concerns, including this one about sort of how the company is managing various programs and operational performance. So I'd say, in general, of course, it's very difficult to demonstrate a cause and effect with such a large and complicated system. So, in particular, this instance, the company's management of the large load interconnection process, we don't, I think, have a lot of evidence of intentional staffing reductions or intentional reductions in O&M spending. And I'd say that this issue in particular doesn't necessarily strike me as an incentive or capital bias problem, to the extent that interconnecting more large loads results in large growth, load growth for the company, which leads to more need for infrastructure investments and capital spending. So I don't think this is necessarily a demonstration of a capital bias per se, but agree that it seems like an overall question of the company's preparedness and sort of organization and management of these various programs. So I think, as demonstrated here, there's definitely concerns with the way that the interconnection process was handled and managed, and the company's readiness for a change in business structure. And then as regards the other concerns that you raised regarding potential capital bias and sort of all of the other investigations that staff has conducted this year, I guess I would just observe that, lucky for us, we have a brand new general electric rate case in front of the commission, which provides an opportunity for parties, trial staff, everybody at the commission to sort of holistically review the company's performance, operation, programs, and I think just creates a venue for us to kind of take that conversation and further it. So a little bit of a parsed conversation, and I hear the concern, and I think that is something that trial staff shares as a concern of a capital bias and a general reflection that the investigations into the company's performance have raised serious concerns in a number of different venues, and look forward to a lovely rate case where we can further that conversation.
Does anybody else have anything to add before I turn it over to Commissioner Gilman?
Ms. O'Neill explained it well. Nothing more from me, Chairman.
Thanks, Commissioner Gilman.
Thanks. That's such a positive note from Ms. O'Neill. Appreciate it. Mr. Dalkey, I'm curious, understanding there seem to be significant delays in the SIS, like studies themselves. What's the time frame we're talking between receiving an application and signing the SIS agreement, right? Because that has to happen first. They sign that agreement, then do the SIS studies. Are there concerns about the timeliness of that portion of the process too, or is it really the SIS study itself that's problematic?
Yeah, thanks. That didn't pop out as much of an issue, the going from an application to a system impact study. I'm just looking like at a handful of examples of where those go. I mean, it depends. I think, no, I think each situation potentially is different regarding the responsiveness of both sides and the sophistication and ability of the applicant, for example, to know and then provide the key parameters to a system impact study. So I think some of that variation can impact how long it takes to go from the initial basic application to signing a system impact study agreement with the necessary parameters the utility needs to kind of kick off that study. That variation at most is maybe a couple months, and they're always, every situation could be, there could be unique circumstances justifying timeliness. Some of them move quickly, and so that part didn't stand out for us. It didn't come up from customers' perspectives as much either. It was really the study itself, getting the agreement, after the agreement to conduct a study is signed, the timeline to then get that study back was kind of the biggest bottleneck we observed. There's a small handful then of prospective customers that got through a system impact study, and then things become, I think, a little bit more, I don't know, like more detailed investigation. There's a facilities study that I think is more than designed to like identify specific infrastructure investments that would be needed. So the system impact study is kind of a first cut, and then depending on the findings, usually you would then go to thinking about what are the actual investments in an additional study. And that can take time too. There's just a much smaller sample size of customers that have gone through that. And the few that we talked to that were in that stage, it had some concerns as well, but they're kind of, it then moves kind of more to like commercial negotiations and then thinking through all what that specifically is. So that's, for all those reasons, I think we kind of were highlighting the system impact studies where kind of the large majority of these applicants are currently sitting.
Okay, thanks. And then I think you had pointed out that they went from about like 2 to 3 large load applications a year to 18 in 2024. It's almost 2026. So the 2024 information is a little stale. I'm not asking how many they've gotten this year, but do we have any information or evidence that they have been staffing up? I mean, I think I saw they're using a contractor, but at this point, we've been well over a year understanding the new pace of these applications, at least within public service. So I'm curious if you have any understanding if the staffing levels have been adjusted in that this is not a brand new issue.
Yeah, I mean, so I'll qualify this by saying, we could ask for more specifics if we're curious from the company themselves on what the staffing has been around this. We did get some indication from our discussions and discovery that the turnover challenges were like within the last year or two, just in terms of employees leaving the company for various reasons. We did hear, I think, from the perspective from one or more prospective customers going back into 2023, a person or people they were working with had some left abruptly, and that kind of coincided with some broader restructuring the company underwent, I think, back then. And all that's a roundabout way to say, beyond the mentioning of working out an agreement with a engineering consulting firm, there wasn't, we didn't see examples or data points from the company that they've successfully been able to staff up. I think it's a tight labor market to find engineers to do these studies. We heard that. And that's kind of behind why some left, and perhaps could be why, the company hasn't found more. But no, we didn't get like any clear indication that there's new employees coming in, in a large, to a large degree, to focus on this problem specifically.
Okay. I have a big question, sorry. Are you aware of kind of, or have any of the technical insights into the degree of manual versus automated processes that go into these SIS studies? I know like on the distribution side of things, we're working toward more automated updates of things like hosting capacity, load capacity, mapping. Is there a corollary kind of at this system level that would help to speed up these processes in what feels like a very manual, labor intensive area? Have you seen examples, or is it worth looking for examples of, is this more automated elsewhere that just makes this go quicker? Because other states are seeing more applications and somehow, executing.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't have a good handle on the technical pieces around the feasibility of that. I know Katie has looked into studies in other states, and I don't know if she's seen examples that might be insightful for us. And then maybe the final thought on that I have is we could consider, or the company itself, if they're listening, like I think has every right to file a response in this proceeding to this report and what we're saying, and some of these questions around what could be done. I think they have they very well could provide some perspective to if we wanted them to, or they may decide to do it on their own accord regardless. And questions like these, I think, could be good to pose. But beyond that, I'm sorry, I don't have very good technical insights on that.
No, yeah, just wondering, kind of raising the question, and are we doing this perhaps in not the most efficient way from the start? So we should expect the kind of results we have. And then regarding the communications to customers on delays for the SIS studies, am I right that you asked the company for any kind of indication of these communications and they did not provide a single piece or a single documentation, an email, anything on any sort of communication to a customer expressing the delays?
That's correct. We didn't get any response. The response we got was a statement from the company that they do communicate with customers when their studies experience delays, but that the company doesn't track these communications. End quote, if you will. And then we didn't get, we asked for things like that and didn't receive any.
So therefore, they have no idea. Therefore, we have no idea how frequent, how detailed, like any understanding on what these communications entail if they do exist.
Yeah, I mean, the company knows, but what they do or didn't do, I think to some extent, that if they can track that down, if they are tracking it to any degree. We heard secondhand from our conversations with prospective customers, concerns around that, deadlines being passed, not hearing anything. We heard anecdotal examples of that, trying to reach out. Sometimes there was a delayed response, things like that. Nothing super specific, but we didn't ask prospective customers to provide us their emails. We were just trying to get a sense of what their experience in general was like. And so that's kind of the secondhand perspective we heard around the communication challenges from them.
Okay. And then regarding these, I don't know what to call them besides lost SIS studies, whereby they've gotten 7 complete but can only produce 3. So what to take from that is they appear to have no sort of proper filing and retention system to have access to these after maybe 1 or 2 or however many individual employees leave.
Yeah, I think it was like that component of the response, along with some of the inability to produce some of the documentation we requested around communications, and all of the studies, that I think kind of motivated some of our thinking around Jeff's earlier comments around the tracking and the customer management and all of that. So yes, I mean, that was our experience. There were recently completed studies, like within the past few years, that they indicated that they did, but weren't able to produce for the reasons that they kind of told us when we met with them.
Okay. Commissioner Plant, I just have 3 more questions. Mostly. They might have subparts, but I'm not conceiving that right now. So Mr. Jockey, as I understand, like in the SIS study itself, there's a timeline, but then the OAT has its own timeline within the tariff that they're supposed to provide these SIS studies. So, I mean, it's very clear from this information, the company's out of compliance with their own tariff. They seem to be fully aware of this. I mean, if 75% of customers, even in the SIS phase, are out of compliance time-wise with that, and it's possible the others are just too new to be out of compliance yet. So I mean, I guess, are there potential remedies? I understand you're not maybe here to talk legally, but there's like the contractual angle and then the tariff angle, and just trying to understand the implications of that for the company in clearly being out of compliance with both on an entirely regular basis.
Yeah. So not being a lawyer, I won't make any compliance conclusions regarding that. On my read of the open access tariff that specifies this, there's a soft 60-day timeline for system impact studies with the option to extend it if the utility needs to for whatever reasons, with some obligations around notification, communications, communication of new of revised deadlines, as well as the reasoning for the delay. And it's the combination of those things and some of the, I don't know, anecdotes from customers that I think concerned us around that aspect, and it's just not being handled and managed as specified in the tariff. But I think, importantly for us and in Colorado, just like how a utility should be just doing business, right? Like when delays occur and things like that. So that was some of the challenges that I think we had with that. I don't know, legal implications of that with the FERC tariff, and that's FERC stuff, and we're the commission. I do think, like, in this, the reporting is potentially low-hanging fruit. This may be this. I don't know, but our audit questions may have been the first time this. Certainly, from our perspective, was the first time all of this information was organized together and then provided, in a file and a folder. So figuring that out, tracking it over time, as we have now kind of begun to diagnose this challenge to see how it's getting better. I think just the transparency and the shining the transparency on it could help. The other component is, I think from what we learned in this investigation, I think we're in a decent position to think about kind of how we could structure some reporting requirements and on what basis we could request that. It may require some, conversations with counsel and so on. I think beyond that, we could start thinking about if, there's performance expectations or baselines and requirements that we could think about setting around just how we would expect or want this to proceed going forward for customers and for Colorado. That would maybe just require a little more work that we didn't get into in this initial investigation, but I think those are kind of maybe two prongs that one could start to think about that come to my mind for kind of next steps or ways to think about improving this process.
Okay. No, thanks. I think that's really helpful. Ms. Bolivini, just a question on the what you understood from customers in the first half of the presentation about their willingness or interests or opportunities around connecting in terms of flexibility of their loads. And I'm curious, it sounds like kind of generally like a lot of customers are willing. It may depend on their exact load type, like how deep, how flexible that looks. Clearly the commission's been incredibly interested in this and expressed that in the past, yet it seems here like the friction is actually coming from the utility. So I'm curious, have these customers reported, like, is there any discussion with the utilities when they are bringing these applications or beginning to have these discussions around a desire or a need or the virtues of flexibility and how that might be treated, or does that discussion never seem to occur at that level at this point?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Commissioner Gilman. I think that what we mostly heard from customers was a general willingness to consider flexibility. I did get a sense that there are high-level conversations that go on between the customer and the utility, maybe like as they're submitting that application or maybe before they submit it. But I think that there are probably other concerns that are coming to the table in those early conversations before flexibility. So maybe availability of generation capacity, for example. We were able to talk. Oh, go ahead. Sorry. Oh, I thought somebody was piping in. We were able to talk to customers that have done quite a lot in other states, and so I think what we heard in terms of their willingness is maybe their experience working with utilities in other states. But it is hard to say. We didn't necessarily ask point blank, like, what's the state of these conversations with the utilities in Colorado.
Thanks. And then just kind of my last question, it might be more of a comment than a question. I mean, I hear on a more consistent than I would like basis about complaints, particularly with Public Service Company of Colorado of all size customers, new customers trying to connect loads. So I know we had focused this in the large load area to really get our feet under us and get an idea on what this experience looks like. But it certainly seems, at least anecdotally to me, that these problems are more widespread in terms of communication, responsiveness, ability to get kind of timely and concrete information back to customers. And so perhaps just something to think of as we kind of move forward with next steps. You know, I think the problem certainly appears to be more widespread from a customer service standpoint. And so how do we begin to better understand kind of the experience of all customers of varying sizes? You know, it's very hard for us sitting here to understand where exactly the pain points are, what specific experiences look like. And to the extent there are repetitive problems in certain areas, you know, that's certainly an area it would be good to have more focus on, and we just don't have that information at this point. So I see this as a good step, but kind of just wanted to indicate, I mean, I think all of us get these communications, but there are widespread problems of different customer sizes. And so I think thinking about how do we cast the net a little wider to better understand performance for customers of many different sizes and trying to connect and really understand where those delays and concerns and communication issues are, so that we can begin to track and report on those and try to move forward to hold the company accountable for good service there. So yeah, I don't know if you have any specific ideas on that, but just wanted to bring up, I think it's bigger than a large load problem, although this was a good place to start.
Yeah, I can certainly appreciate that observation. And as you mentioned, this particular task was focused on large customers. But what I can say is that opening up this doorway, I guess, between customers and staff seemed to work very well for this instance. Now, I'm not entirely sure how we would do that for other sizes of customers, but having this specifically as a venue where customers could talk to PUC staff directly seemed to be appreciated by customers. So I think that's about all I can offer here, but I don't know if my colleagues can offer anything else.
No, I mean, I guess maybe, yeah, Katie, one of the things that struck me as useful in addition to what we've just learned and laid out here is these connections and the conversations we've had with these current and prospective customers weren't just one-offs. There's cases where we get updates, as their experience has evolved since we last talked to them. We've got, a deck of contacts now that we can go back to, or some, we've done follow-up. It hasn't just been single meetings. So I think that's kind of what Katie was talking about. That's been beneficial, at least on this large load side. And Commissioner Gilman, I appreciate you raising the broader kind of net point, because the queue process we specified out here, and the reference to the open access transmission tariff, et cetera, is for these large customers that would have an impact to the high voltage system. And so it's this is that process for that level of customer. And I'm no expert on it, but I believe there's a kind of parallel but different process for smaller distribution level customers that interconnect that could be having its own set of challenges, along the lines of some of the additional feedback you've heard from customers who are more sized to that, and reporting changes to this to this process we outlined here doesn't on its own may not change things on the distribution system interconnection side. So it's a good point.
Thanks. Those are my questions for now. Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Commissioner Gilman. And I'll have one follow-up question after Commissioner Plant along those lines of next steps. But Commissioner Plant.
Thank you. And yeah, thanks for this report. This is really helpful, and something that I feel like we hear about through a filter, but I've never actually heard directly from. So it's fascinating to get this response. I do think there's a little irony, if what I'm understanding is correct, that the large loads are having delay problems because of staffing issues at the utility from people getting hired away by large loads. Seems to be problematic cycle there. I just had a couple of quick questions around the flexibility question that Commissioner Gilman touched on there at the end. As you were talking to these companies about flexibility, did you get a sense that they saw flexibility primarily from the perspective of modulating their own demand, maybe managing their demand across time in order to provide flexibility, or were they thinking more along the lines of on-site energy storage, or on-site generation, or I think there was a recent report about large loads basically investing in flexibility on the distribution system as a sort of offsetting flexibility proposal. But what did the flexibility kind of look like in your discussions with these large loads?
I think that when we asked about this, it probably covered a wide range of different types of flexibility. I think by virtue of customers emphasizing, well, different types of large loads have different capabilities, to me that says that's more about actually modulating their demand. I think the interest that we heard on bringing your own generation, and while customers expressed interest in both front of the meter and behind the meter options, that that still included utilizing behind the meter generation in some way, that could also be a flexibility option as well.
And I may add on that, if I may. Katie's absolutely right. I do recall a few examples when we got to kind of some specifics on what that could be. Some of the folks who have kind of been developing data centers for decades, past earlier waves of the build out. It struck me that I think they do, and they're used to in terms of their supply chain and development of getting backup generators, diesel gensets and so on as redundancy and kind of as a piece of that. And so there was some reference to backup generation. I think there was some discussion around interest and openness to considering battery storage if that would help the grid. So I certainly recall conversations around, resources on site that could be turned on to help as needed. And I think there was willingness around flexibility and demand modulation, and I think some of the fully vertically integrated data center operators and kind of that then consume the data center service through whatever they use it for could consider that. I think a lot of the other developers we talk to, or even developers that then own and operate the data center but lease it out, have the challenge of working on, part of the development cycle is figuring out who exactly the customers are, and so they're in a position where it's harder for them to early on make commitments about the consumption restrictions of their customers if they're going to kind of try and sign them up later or once it's built. So I think that piece sometimes comes in when it gets to demand modulation, but it really depends on who's developing and what they may be able to kind of commit to or offer on that side.
Is there, or do you have a sense that there's an evaluation of the most effective type of flexibility depending on where they're locating on the system and where they're, interconnecting and what the existing, sort of constraints are or challenges?
We didn't have the chance to talk to the utilities specifically about this. So I guess what I'm about to say is mostly from that customer perspective. I think that if I had to guess, they would likely be optimizing for flexibility for their operations. In terms of what would be most beneficial to the grid, I can't say for sure, but I don't know that customers necessarily have that level of insight into grid operations. I mean, we heard, and we put this in the report, that sometimes service territory boundaries aren't even clear. We also heard that some customers would be interested in knowing, like, what are the beneficial locations on the system for them to locate a data center, but unfortunately that information is not readily available. So again, thinking about it from the customer perspective, I don't know that they necessarily have that level of information to know what flexibility is beneficial to the grid, in addition to what's beneficial for their operations.
So your sense is that the utility isn't communicating that to them as a part of these discussions?
Again, I can't say for certain, but my guess would be not. I think I'll leave it there.
As it relates to the to on-site generation, how does any on-site generation that a data center or large load might install, how does that intersect with our overall emissions standards in the state? If it's behind the meter and not interconnected, it's kind of off the book. As soon as it gets interconnected, does it become a part of the overall picture? How does that get handled specifically? Do you know?
Just to clarify, Commissioner Plant, are you asking, is there a difference in the emissions accounting whether the resource is behind the meter or front of the meter? Is that a fair way to summarize your question?
Yeah, and how it sort of gets integrated into, a utility's emissions profile.
That I do not have knowledge on. I don't know if Stephen, Jeff, or even Aaron have information on that. We like we said earlier in the presentation, there are certainly customers we spoke with who are subject to Colorado statutory emissions targets, and so maybe behind the meter it might be, but I'm really not sure. Do others have an idea?
No, it's a great question, and it might be something that we would want to consider more explicitly, Commissioner Plant, like as we're developing a tariff, a large load tariff and flexibility provisions. You know, it's a good, it makes me curious to the extent there are any, I don't know, backup diesel generators, for example, on existing industrial sites that are signed up for Xcel's interruptible programs. I don't know to the extent that that exists, but you know, like, is it how much of it is curtailing the process if and when they get called versus, you know, turning on that backup generator? I don't believe it would come directly into the accounting for the company's assets in terms of emissions, you know, production from just kind of knowing how they get added up at a high level, you know, in the planning processes. It's unclear to me, I guess, to the extent that they are accounted for if and when the company decides to call on them. And in general, when those kind of interruptions occur only during grid emergencies, to the extent that if there are diesel generators, for example, that may have air permit restrictions, you know, it may be minimal enough in terms of the emergency needs for the grid where that's compliant, you know, turning on a diesel generator to provide relief to the grid. But it's a great question, and like it would make perfect sense to think through what's providing the flexibility as we're developing flexibility processes and tariffs, and to the extent, you know, that there's emissions associated or not associated with that flexibility, especially if, you know, there's potentially a need to use them a little more frequently, then that's something we should consider.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and confirm. I think that's all right, what Stephen said. I don't think there currently isn't a mechanism by which we would account for that. And there are certainly, I think probably the largest source right now would be things like hospitals that have backup supply, which certainly exists today in the state and are not accounted for. You know, they don't run very often, but they wouldn't be accounted for in the transmission or in the emissions tracking. But it's a good flag because to the extent that these are much larger facilities with potentially much larger backup generators that might be operating more often, it may be something to sort of think through more carefully as we develop the large load tariff.
Great. Thank you. That's all the questions I had. I appreciate it.
Hey, one last question for you guys, and I just reiterate and echo what others have said. Thanks so much for doing this. This is just really fantastic for us to be able to hear directly from customers. So two suggestions going forward. Would you be willing to continue, you know, in a sort of structured, more formal way, just reaching out to these guys, whatever the right cadence is, maybe every 3 to 6 months? I defer to you on what the right cadence is, but just make it an ongoing formal effort to reach out to these guys. And then second, I wouldn't mind if perhaps on a longer time frame, and I think going back to Commissioner Gilman's point, you also reached out to some intermediate customers who are smaller than these guys. I know we've gotten letters from, I mean, I've seen 3 or 4 that are alleging, you know, very significant breakdowns in communications, billing errors, customer service. And I'd love it if you guys would be willing to follow up with them and report back what you find. So I don't know if that's a Ms. O'Neill question or somehow we need to talk to council and vote on it. But Ms. O'Neill, are you open to keeping this investigatory docket and process open and keep on talking to these large customers and maybe expand it to sort of the next level down that more in the 5 to 10 megawatt range, or some of these home builders who seem really upset with customer performance, and we're seeing it in the media too. So Ms. O'Neill?
Yeah, so let me think about that. So yes, certainly I think we're open to sort of continued outreach. I think the question will be just sort of what's the most efficient way for us to do that, and sort of timing of that, and like, is there a confidential way that people can reach out to us or file comments, and just trying to, so yes, I think that makes sense. Perhaps let us think about like what the most efficient way is to do that, and sort of the timing or cadence of such outreach. But yes, I think continued outreach and hearing from customers makes sense.
And maybe you could bring that back into mid or late January, CWM, something like that, depending, at your discretion.
Yeah, mid-January feels like really close, but yes, understood, Chairman, and I think
end of January, early February. Commissioner Gilman,
I mean, I don't know that it's even just moderate size. I don't even know if 5 megawatts is a moderate size customer, but I think we're hearing these things across the board. So there'll be a ton more people at a much lower level of size. I wonder if, I'm not sure it's sustainable to continue to have our staff like personally reach out to each of these customers. So I wonder if there is like a more automated survey or process that can be set up to follow up with customers who have had interactions or received a new service connection, to really understand like how the communications went, how quickly the process went, so we can get like really a larger data set to understand like a broader swath of experience here, and where things are going well and where things are really not going well. So just to point out, I'm not sure we can expect you all to reach out independently, but maybe there is kind of a more automated like surveying tool or something that can be used to kind of bucket the information so that we understand what to follow up on. Is it the timeline for X or Y, or certain types of communication that continue to be the pain points? And then I think we can really like focus our efforts if we have kind of a broader set of information coming in. So I know not something we do now, but I would just point out, I think this is probably the most difficult for the smallest customers who like don't necessarily feel like they have someone at public service they can just call or whatever that may be. So anyway, just some interest in figuring out, is there just a more automated way to do this where we get more feedback?
Yeah, Commissioner Gilman, I was sort of thinking along the same way, but also trying to make sure that it's a confidential process, right? Like most public comments or processes we have now are sort of are public, and this was intentionally very confidential. So I think I was thinking along the same lines of like, what's a better way to do this where we can sort of efficiently collect information that's sensitive about staff's time, but creates, confidentially and assurance to folks that their information and comments will be, maintained confidential.
All right. Thank you so much for leading this just really fantastic work and really helpful findings. And we'll keep going. Why don't we take like a 5-minute break till 2:35, or do you need longer, Ms. Mulvaney?
That should be fine. That's great. And thank you for the break.
Yeah, why don't we take a 10-minute break till 2:40. We'll come back at 2:40 with the next phase. Thanks, guys. Ms. Mulvaney, take us away.
Great, thanks, Chair. So you all already know me, but just for the purposes of our audience, again, I'm Katie Mulvaney. I'm on the Commission's Research and Emerging Issues team, which we abbreviate REI. And for this section of the Commissioner Information Meeting, I'm joined by my teammate from REI, Liz Bourget. Today, we're going to be presenting on research that the REI team has been conducting over the last several months, focused on how utilities and regulators across the U.S. are adapting to new large loads in a few select states. Next slide, please. So REI's steering committee, which consists of leadership across the commission, determined earlier this year that large loads would be a critical topic for REI to investigate. But this work is also motivated by some other policy happenings in the state of Colorado, including the data center bills that the legislature has introduced but not yet passed in the last two sessions, as well as the large load tariff filing that the commission ordered Excel to file in early 2026. Ms. Bourget and I will go over a bit of information on the scope of REI's research to start out, and then we'll walk you through our findings. Next slide, please. So REI's research looked into 8 different states across 6 categories concerning large loads. We researched the states of Virginia, Texas, Oregon, Ohio, Arizona, Georgia, Nevada, and Indiana. These states we chose because they either have significant existing large loads connected to their systems, especially from data centers, or they are expecting significant loads soon, as you can see from the chart on this slide. They're also implementing legislation, special large load tariffs, and other policies of note. I did want to note that all the conclusions, key takeaways, and any points of synthesis that we make in this presentation are only focused on these 8 states. And so REI does not intend to make statements about large load trends across the whole US. We focused on 6 areas relevant for large load regulatory issues in these states, including forecasting, resource planning, emissions impact, transmission planning, and then 2 topics that are more related to tariffs, rate design and cost allocation, and then also risk allocation and ratepayer protections. Before we dive in, I wanted to ask again what your preference is, Chair, for discussion and questions. Do you want us to pause at the end of these 6 categories? Do you want to hold all commissioner questions till the end? What do you prefer?
Yeah, why don't you assume we're going to hold all our questions till the end, but I don't think anybody on this bench is shrinking violet, so we'll ask questions if we have to. And I do have one comment on this graph, which is under construction is very different than planned. So if there's a way to disaggregate it, that'd be interesting, but keep going.
That is fair. Perhaps a comment for our colleagues at Deloitte.
Yeah.
But appreciate that. We will look forward to your questions at the end. So I'm going to pass it off to Ms. Bourget to talk more about the scope of our research.
Thanks. So Ms. Mulvaney outlined the 8 states that we reviewed as part of our research. Information in this presentation is based on our research into 9 utilities and 2 regional transmission organizations in these 8 states. And you can see the utilities and RTOs laid out on this slide. So large load customers are defined by the expected peak demand of the customer. However, the size definition of what qualifies as a large load customer varies by state and utility. You can see the range in the diagram we've provided with load size definitions in megawatts. This is a survey of load size definitions across states we've researched, which includes new customer classes, special rate schedules, or in large load legislation. The size threshold that distinguishes a large load customer from other customers in the states that we reviewed ranges from 2 megawatts in AES Indiana's high load factor tariff to 100 megawatts in a recent Georgia PSC rule regarding large load customers.
Thank you. So I'm going to kick us off with our findings. And like I said, we'll move through each of those 6 topic areas. And I'm going to start off with forecasting and forecast certainty. So our research here focused on forecasts specifically that were used in both integrated resource planning and transmission planning. And we found that the methodologies varied widely across the utilities and RTOs that we researched, so much so that trying to compare forecasted demand across utilities and states is really a challenging exercise. And one reason a comparison is so challenging is that the threshold for including a large load in a utility's forecast is just not standardized across states. And it can also span the stages of the interconnection process. So that includes the very early requests for electric service from the utility to sign letters of agreement or memoranda of understanding from customers, to the later stages of the process when a more binding energy services agreement or interconnection agreement is signed. And we see loads get included in forecasts at all of these stages. Next slide, please. We did find some common general practices in forecasting that we wanted to share. So first, utilities are often working very closely with their customer account managers to decide how much demand is coming from each large load. And it's actually pretty rare that a utility uses a specific formula for large load growth, with the exception being Dominion, Virginia, just because they have so many more data points on which to base a formula. And we'll actually go over Dominion, Virginia as a case study on the next slide. Another practice that we wanted to highlight is the practice of discounting. So by discounting, I mean that utilities will consider groups of large loads and then reduce their requested demand by some amount based on different categories, like how far along they are in the interconnection process or another means. And so the table on this slide illustrates some of those discounting methodologies. One example that I'll highlight is in ERCOT and NV Energy, and they both reduce demand based on how far along a large load is in the interconnection process. For example, ERCOT reduces demand from load with an interconnection agreement, which is pretty binding, by 50%, and then loads that are earlier in the process that have maybe just stated their interests and submitted a letter to ERCOT, they reduce that load by 75%. And then finally, we see that utilities are using different scenarios for large load growth that represent more optimistic or pessimistic futures. Next slide. So like I said, we wanted to highlight Dominion, Virginia's forecasting practices as a case study, even though they're not the norm. So Dominion has had so many data centers come online over the years that they're actually able to create a statistical model of how they think large load growth will proceed into the future. Unfortunately, the finer details of the model and the variables they use are not publicly available, but the results of Dominion's meter demand forecasting are shown on this graph in the red line, along with the amount of large load demand in different stages of Dominion's interconnection process. So I'll kind of go through what we're seeing here. One earlier stage of the process involves signing a construction letter of authorization, or CLOA, and that's shown by the orange bars on this chart. And that just allows for construction to begin on transmission and distribution infrastructure. One of the final steps in Dominion's interconnection process is an electric service agreement, or ESA, and that is shown by the blue bars on this chart. And so you can think of the aggregated demand in these blue bars as a maximum contracted capacity, so to speak. But what's not shown on this graph is a minimum demand requirement, which Ms. Bergay is going to discuss later. And for Dominion special and new large load rate class, that's 85% for transmission and distribution charges. So the key takeaway here is that the ESA contracted capacity in the blue bars is significantly lower than the IRP forecasted meter demand shown by the red line through about 2031. And Dominion doesn't explain explicitly in its IRP why this is the case, but REI's interpretation is that it's due to some combination of both customers' typical demand being somewhere between the minimum demand and that ESA contracted capacity, in addition to features of the statistical model that show not all contracted ESA demand shows up. I am going to pass it off now to Ms. Borgay to talk about resource planning.
Can I just ask you a question on that? Can you go back to that prior
Sure.
graph? So I look at this and when they say metered load is below signed electric service agreements, I assume that means that people signed agreements but never built the data center. Or that's how I interpreted this. So even if you have whatever in 2024, 7,000 megawatts of signed contracts, the actual load is like 60% of that. So that's how I interpreted that. Is that a correct interpretation? Or are these or is the red built data centers that don't use their contracted maximum?
I think we might be seeing the effect of both here, Chair. And I think, you know, the first interpretation that you explained is certainly a part of this. But because it says metered demand and we're looking at the ESA being like a contracted capacity, I do think that there's a difference between like what the data center is using day to day. I'm sure that they try to be above that minimum demand because they're going to have to pay it anyways. But you know, I think it could be both.
I'd request you guys look into this further if you would. I mean, we're being asked to approve generation for 100%. I mean, we're being asked to approve, we've been asked to approve generation for customers that haven't signed contracts. But the assumption has been we should build generation for 100% of the signed contracts. And this seems like a critical piece of information to sort through how to interpret signed contracts. So any context you could give us on this would be enormously helpful.
Sure, yeah, we can do that. And I think we can include some of the examples from the other slide about how other utilities apply those discounting factors, even to loads that have signed the equivalent of an ESA, in addition to what Dominion does.
Yeah, and I'm less interested in the forecast and more interested in the historical experience. So I look at this and go, oh, we have 7 or 8 years of historical experience.
Nice.
So what happened when you have signed ESAs? Does the load show up? And this says only 60% of the impact as coincident system peak shows up even with signed contracts.
Is some of it time delayed though? I mean, you've got a signed contract and then there's another couple of years before you actually have the metered load. Is that a piece of this as well? That's what I was kind of seeing when I saw this, but I don't know.
That's a question that I had as well, Commissioner Plant. I think it is accounted for because those blue bars are changing a little bit with time. Like, for example, like 2025, the ESA level is slightly lower than like 2028. So I think that is already accounted for on this chart, but it is curious that it's sort of like levels off.
Anyway, I'd ask you to see if you can figure out what the historical experience is, the actual experience. That would be really useful for our process.
Yeah, we can do our best finding what data is available.
Thank you.
So over to you, Ms. Bourget, for resource planning.
Thank you. So the next section of the presentation looks at how utilities are considering new large loads in their resource planning and acquisition process. We reviewed utility IRPs and looked into whether there are any special procurement processes specific to large loads. And while we didn't find anything notable related to large loads in resource planning in IRPs, we did dig into special procurement processes for large loads in Indiana and Nevada. So in Indiana, House Bill 1007 is a unique example of a state trying to prepare for large loads in resource planning and acquisition. HB 1007 sets up 2 pathways for the expedited approval of generation and other energy infrastructure projects needed as a result of load growth and large load customers. And the two pathways here are a result of utilities having different approaches to how they handle large loads. One pathway for expedited approval is the expedited generation resource plan process. This can be used when any load triggers a need for generation capacity greater than 5% of a utility's average peak demand or equal to 150 megawatts, whichever is smaller. This pathway is an effort for utilities to get approval from the commission for a new plan to serve additional load and then go out and acquire those resources. The second pathway is explicitly focused on large load customers and creates a process for utilities to petition for projects to serve large loads. This can be thought of essentially as a large load CPCN, but specific to incremental load. And this pathway has more stringent protections for ratepayers, in which customers have to pay 80% of costs of their energy infrastructure project. Moving on to Nevada. In Nevada, NV Energy's Clean Transition Tariff, or CTT, is a voluntary tariff that has what we're calling a bring your own generation approach to resource acquisition for new large loads. It allows new large load customers to pay a premium to bring a new clean energy resource online. Under the CTT, large load customers can enter into an energy supply agreement with NV Energy for energy from a clean energy resource outside of the resource planning conducted in its IRP. NV Energy must submit each ESA for a new clean energy resource to the PUC for approval. In its first ESA under the CTT, NV Energy submitted an ESA with Google for PUCN approval that would bring on a new 115 megawatt advanced geothermal generation resource online. And this ESA for the geothermal resource was approved by the PUCN earlier this year. Another part of resource planning and acquisition for large loads is a consideration of on-site generation capabilities of the new large load customer. On-site generation is covered by a few large load rate schedules. In Ohio, large load customers can use on-site generation to ensure that they don't exceed their contracted capacity, and customers with on-site generation must be able to instantaneously curtail load equal to or greater than the on-site generation. In Texas, large load customers now must report their on-site generation capabilities, and during grid emergencies, ERCOT may direct large loads with on-site backup generation that does not export to the grid to deploy their backup generation or curtail their load. And in Arizona, large load customers with on-site generation may be able to sell their energy back to the utility through the Salt River Project's price plan for large load customers. So moving now to greenhouse gas emissions impact. Most large load tariffs, as well as legislation and rulemaking regulating large loads that we reviewed, didn't call out GHG emissions impacts of large loads or require any GHG emissions reductions requirements on large load customers. There was one exception in Oregon. HB 25I-0418E requires the PUC to create a tariff for large energy users and also requires that the PUC must consider whether rates established through the large load tariff will impede the utility's ability to meet its existing clean energy targets or reduce GHG emissions consistent with state policy. Also, PGE's IRP/CEP update acknowledges that PGE's 2040 emissions target is a total emissions target and not an emissions intensity target. So increased load may affect their ability to hit the emissions target. Meanwhile, APS in Arizona is an example of a utility modifying its goals related to clean energy. APS has changed its previous zero carbon electricity by 2050 goal to an aspirational carbon neutral approach and has abandoned its interim clean energy targets. And the press release announcing that change stated that it was in part due to load growth. So I'll pass it back to Ms. Mulvaney.
Thank you. I'm gonna move us right along to transmission planning. So we saw that few states have special processes specifically for large loads in transmission planning. And here we were really trying to think about like long range or long-term transmission planning. One exception is perhaps Texas, where large loads, including both their magnitude from forecasts and their location, were a feature of last year's ERCOT Regional Transmission Planning Report. We also saw that several states require upfront payments or securities from large load customers that are specific to transmission infrastructure. And Ms. Bergay is going to talk in some more detail about these sorts of risk allocation mechanisms in the next few sections. We also saw that some utilities are planning to evaluate the transmission upgrades required from groups of large customers, which is also known as cluster studies, rather than just looking at one customer at a time. And finally, while it's not a common practice, we saw that the broad long-term transmission planning processes conducted by Arizona Public Service and PJM do actually note whether specific projects will serve a new large customer in their public-facing materials. Next slide, please. So I am going to move us into the rate design, cost allocation, and ratepayer protection portion of our presentation. We're going to be talking largely about the states that have tariffs specific to large loads in this section, and that includes 5 out of our 8 states: Arizona, Indiana, Nevada, Ohio, and Virginia. But before diving into tariff specifics, we wanted to highlight that we are seeing large loads treated in some way differently from other customers in the states that we reviewed. And the level of this differentiation and the manner that it's achieved falls into 3 main categories. So one includes separate customer classes where cost tracking for the purposes of a rate case is done separately. The second category is special rate schedules where large load customer costs are not tracked separately. And then the third category includes a few other means of special treatment. So first, some states have created entirely new customer classes for either large loads or data centers. And also the costs from these new customers have already or will show up separately from all other customer classes in a utility's cost of service analysis in a rate case proceeding. And without this distinction, large loads and data centers may, for example, be lumped in with other customers taking service at a transmission voltage. And so the costs that are caused specifically by large loads may not be clear. We see a new special customer class being initiated by way of legislation in Virginia and Oregon, and also just through the rate making process by the utility Arizona Public Service. And one reason given in either the legislation or the rate proposals is that high load factor for very large loads requires different treatment from other customers. In the second category, we're seeing utilities create special rate schedules for large loads, but not all costs from large loads are tracked separately from other customer classes. But similar to the first category, the rate schedule applicability will distinguish large loads and data centers by either calling data centers out directly or by specifying the source of electricity supply in the case of Nevada. And then finally, the last category, we're seeing special treatment of large loads in Texas and Georgia, despite lack of a special utility tariff. Public Service Commission rulemaking in Georgia and legislation in Texas both acknowledge the risk that very large customers can present to the state's electricity systems and the need for large customers to contribute to the cost of their interconnection. Next slide. We'll now cover some of the features of the large load tariffs, starting with what common themes we were able to find on rate design and cost allocation. and then Ms. Brigay will cover risk allocation and ratepayer protections. So all tariffs, of course, include some terms of applicability, and when it comes to applicable load size, this ranges from 2 megawatts to 70 megawatts, so quite a large range. We see rate discounts for large loads, for example, incentives for economic development, are either not being designed into the newer tariffs, or they're actually being proposed to be taken out in recent rate cases, specifically for Arizona Public Service. We are also seeing many utilities make some clean electricity offerings in these tariffs, and sometimes the option is offered just to lay claim to renewable energy credits from a utility's existing generation. But some tariffs are offering mechanisms where entirely new clean generation is procured on the large customer's behalf. And this latter mechanism is also sometimes called additionality. Next slide, please. We are not seeing a trend in these particular states in cost allocation methodologies. Most states seem to be using standard cost allocation methodologies, for example, based on coincident peak demand or an average and excess method. But two special cases we wanted to highlight. First, just last week or 2 weeks ago, maybe, Virginia's State Corporation Commission approved Dominion's biennial rate case, which included a new special rate schedule for large loads. And so while the SEC allowed Dominion to use its historic cost allocation methodologies, it is directing Dominion to make some filings on alternative cost allocation approaches that better account for load growth, especially when it comes to transmission costs. And then the second special case we'll cover is going to be a case study, and it's proposed by Arizona in their latest and ongoing rate case. Next slide, please. Oh, yes.
Make a comment or a question. I mean, when I hear standard cost allocation methodologies, I view that as like a historic test year and looking at historical costs. But, you know, certainly Colorado legislation and the economic development rate context looks at marginal costs versus average costs. So just as you go through this discussion, if you can like keep that distinction in mind, because that's how when you say standard cost allocation, I think average historical embedded cost, not marginal cost. So sorry to interrupt, but
no, thank you. I appreciate the clarification. And that is what I meant, Chair Blank, by standard cost allocation methodologies. I think I also meant that there's no different methodology that most states are using for growing load versus the existing load. I do think that this case study we're providing is maybe getting into the marginal cost space. So Ms. Brigay, if you could go to the next slide. So again, this comes from Arizona Public Service in their latest rate case. It is ongoing. I checked this morning to see if there were any developments, and there are no decisions yet. But just a few details on APS's special large load tariff. So they have Schedule XHLF, which stands for Extra High Load Factor, and that's been active since 2017. It applies to customers with load 5 megawatts and greater, and they're changing it to be applicable now to either data centers or, in their words, loads that require the procurement of new generation resources to serve their load. So APS is proposing to directly assign the cost of new generation to the customer classes that are driving load growth across its service territory. And so I just want to note and emphasize that this example doesn't include transmission and distribution costs or existing generation in our explanation. If you could go to the next slide, please. So this diagram just shows how APS is proposing to accomplish this cost allocation. So they will divide new resources into two categories: those that replace retiring generation, and that's assumed to serve existing customers. And then the remaining new resources are assumed to serve growing load. The cost of the new resources serving growing load are then allocated based on the contribution of a given customer class to load growth. And they are calling out that Schedule XHLF group in this examination of classes contributing to load growth. Next slide, please. The last topic I'll cover on rate design before I pass things off to Ms. Bergay is flexibility. So flexibility is not necessarily a major feature in the tariffs that we reviewed, but it does seem to be entering the conversation between large loads and utilities, even in those states without a tariff. APS and AES Indiana both have optional riders that give customers a credit for flexibility. Also, Texas legislation SB 6 essentially sets up a market for large load flexibility, and I'll let Ms. Bergay explain that more as a case study on the next slide. And as we were working on this presentation, it seemed like headlines were coming out every single week about large loads and flexibility. So this really is gaining momentum. Some prominent headlines that we've seen include an agreement between Google and Indiana and Michigan Power, and coverage on PJM's contentious fast track interconnection process that involves some proposals on flexibility, and also a VPP aggregator who is operating a service that will create a partnership between VPPs and data centers and hopefully create some capacity space on the grid to help data centers come online faster. And we included a few other sources in a few other stories in our sources, and these slides will be posted to the Commissioner Information Meeting website. So I'll let Ms. Bergay go over that Texas case study.
Thanks. So moving on to a flexibility case study. In Texas, Senate Bill 6 was signed into law in July of 2025. The purpose of SB 6 is to direct the PUCT to develop rules to ensure that large loads contribute to the recovery of the costs to interconnect. We've broken out its requirements regarding flexibility into 3 categories: mandatory curtailment, on-site generation flexibility, and voluntary demand response. SB 6 requires that utilities establish protocols for curtailing load during emergencies for new large load customers. This includes requiring the installation of equipment or technology to allow the load to be curtailed during a firm load shed. This is sometimes referred to as a kill switch and allows ERCOT to have the ability to remotely shut off power during emergencies. Regarding on-site generation, SB 6 states that during grid emergencies, ERCOT may direct large loads with on-site backup generation capable of serving at least 50% of on-site demand. It does not export back to the grid to deploy their backup generation or curtail their load. Additionally, there is an element of voluntary demand response. SB 6 states that ERCOT must develop a reliability service to competitively procure demand reductions from large load customers to be deployed in an anticipated emergency condition. So the next section covers risk allocation and ratepayer protections. The states that we reviewed had varying levels of ratepayer protections while to minimize the impacts that large load customers have on existing customers. And while some states had more ratepayer protections than others, there were some common elements that we found across our review. That includes contract requirements. As large load customers enter into contracts with utilities for electric service, states are attempting to prevent a scenario in which those large loads shut down and leave the state before paying for new infrastructure built specifically to handle that load. Each state we reviewed has a requirement for a minimum contract length. The minimum length varies, but typically ranges between 5 and 15-year contracts. Another common requirement in contracts with large loads is an exit fee requirement, which requires a large load customer to pay a fee if their project is canceled or if they're unable to meet obligations outlined in the contract. These exit fees can be significant, as both I&M in Indiana and Dominion Energy Virginia require that a customer be responsible for any outstanding minimum charges over the remaining length of their contract. Some states allow for contract flexibility, in which customers can reduce their contract capacity if they give notice, or if the capacity can be reassigned to another customer. In Texas, SB 6 includes a requirement that a new large load customer demonstrates site control, for example, a lease, for the proposed location as part of the customer's interconnection request. And a 2025 rule issued by the Georgia PSC requires that any new Georgia Power contract with a large load customer must be submitted to the PSC for review and approval. And in Nevada, any ESA submitted through their clean transition tariff must be submitted to the PUCN for review and approval. Some states have a requirement that large loads pay a monthly minimum demand charge to cover the cost of infrastructure needed to bring electricity to the large load facility and lessen the likelihood that these costs are shifted to existing customers. Where specified, these minimum demand charge requirements are about 80 to 85%. So for example, in AEP Ohio, the stipulation agreement establishing the large load tariff requires that the customers pay for 85% of the energy they say they need, even if they use less. Additionally, with the approval of PUCO, service may be suspended if the large load customer usage exceeds its contract capacity by more than a megawatt. And in Oregon, legislation requiring the PUC to establish a tariff for large load users indicates that the PUC must determine the minimum amount or percentage that the customer must pay, and that will be based on the projected electricity usage of the large load customer. Another common requirement found in 4 states that we reviewed is a mandate that large loads provide proof that they're financially viable at some point during the interconnection request or contract approval process. Financial commitments that we saw in our research include collateral requirements and other security provisions. The collateral requirement in most states is based on the credit rating of the large load company. And additionally, in Texas, large load customers will be required to disclose in their interconnection request if they are requesting substantially similar interconnection elsewhere in Texas that would change, delay, or withdraw their interconnection request. And finally, 3 states that we reviewed have requirements that utilities, or the PUC regulate, report out on large load customer additions. Georgia Power and I&M are required to report out on information on the number of new committed large load customers, information on potential large load customers, and current existing total megawatts of large load customers in service. Reporting is quarterly for Georgia Power and semi-annual for I&M. And in Oregon, HB 25I-0418E requires that the PUC submit a report every other year that reviews trends in load requirements and other implications from large energy customers. So that's it on the section on risk allocation and ratepayer protections. So I'm going to pass it back to Ms. Mulvaney to wrap up.
All right, yes, and this is the last slide we have before we take your questions and discussion. So I guess, where does all this lead us? What does all this mean for rates paid by actual customers, and are ratepayer protections having an impact? And unfortunately, the answer to all these questions, we think, is that it's just too early to say. Some have made an attempt at national level studies, both LBNL and Bloomberg, and the results indicate that large loads can put both upward and downward pressure on rates. But in NRA's opinion, the methodologies of these two national studies limit the conclusions that we can draw from them. And that's because they make it difficult to determine cost causation that might be relevant for regulatory processes. For example, the impact of generation and transmission built specifically for new large loads, how costs are spread between rate classes, and other important factors. They also aggregate information across regions. And so, for example, a result at the national level showing rates decrease overall from load growth may mean that rates are decreasing in one region but increasing in another. We do expect some more information to come out, at least on Texas and California, on the impact of large loads on rates based on some analysis mandates in recent legislation. There has been some more information on rates in PJM, however, and that's based on the RTO's capacity market results and also a deep dive by the Union of Concerned Scientists into transmission planning and investment. And so signs are pointing a bit more clearly there that large loads in data centers are driving prices upward. So that's all we have for you today, and we're happy to take your questions and discussion.
Well, excellent work. Thank you so much. Really helpful. Maybe we'll do a reverse order this time. Commissioner Plant, if you're ready, you want to go first, or I'm happy to if you don't want to.
Yeah, no, I don't have any questions. I really appreciate the research and all the work that went into this, and it's great to have all of the various different models that we've heard so much about sort of collected into one place. So I appreciate it.
Commissioner Gilman.
Thanks. Yeah, wanted to echo the thank you. Very helpful to have all of this collected, as I know this is developing quickly here as well as elsewhere. So very helpful to be tracking what's going on elsewhere. You had laid out kind of the three different sort of cost allocation scenarios, one of which was an independent rate class, then like certain tariff, and then kind of other. And I was curious if, and you just may not have gotten to this depth in your research, if you understood or think there is any indicative kind of cost allocation differential when these large loads are considered their own rate class versus just given a special tariff, and I know it's hard, it's transpiring quickly, every state's different, yada yada, I get it, but just trying to understand kind of the structural difference in cost responsibility, and if there is anything to glean from what's going on in other states in the difference between rate class and just a tariff.
Yeah, I think that it's really early on in the just like existence of some of these tariffs. Some of them haven't even been through like a full cycle of a rate case yet. So, some have showed up like initially in rate cases. But I mean, I think the main distinction and the main distinction is just that in that first category, and maybe Liz, if you could go back to slide 14. The distinction that we were just trying to make is that in that first bucket, you can at least see the cost allocation and costs a little bit more clearly because the large load customer class is like called out totally separately. So, you might see like a residential class, you see like primary general, secondary general, and then you would then see that large load as its own class. And so I think it just makes it a little bit easier to, or it hopefully will make it a little bit easier to see what's going on with costs in those states. And I don't know that we have insight into I guess big differences between each of these categories yet. I will also admit I am not a rate expert by any means, and I don't think Ms. Bourget is either. So there might be others at the commission who might be able to speak more to this, and we can always provide them with this information.
Yeah, no, I very much appreciate it. And then question on, I think it was slide 19 or so. You go to the flexibility case study, which was a Texas example. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, we're off by one number, sorry. So you, and the second bullet here, it indicates that like for grid emergencies, ERCOT could demand that on-site backup essentially be exercised to reduce load like as needed. Is there anything that obliges them to have on-site backup, or are there incentives paid for this? I mean, it seems like if you have it, you must do this. Does anything require them to have it or compensate them for having it? I'm trying to figure out, not that something always has to be in it for the customer, but if this isn't like a mandatory thing to have, it's interesting to have requirements on something that's not mandatory.
Yeah, there is nothing in the text of SB6 that indicated that it was mandatory for a new large customer to have on-site generation, nor was there any sort of like incentive to have on-site generation. So I'm guessing that a customer might have on-site generation for like reliability, like their own reliability, but agreed that it is an interesting note that they are having this kind of requirement for customers that have on-site generation without necessarily having any kind of like incentive for them to have that.
Okay. Thanks. And then on slide 23, another question, also Texas based as it is, on the disclosure requirement. So notably, it seems like this disclosure is only if they have submitted or requested similar interconnection in Texas. So this is only like within the same state. So this wouldn't obligate disclosure if they're also requesting similar interconnections in other states, right?
Correct.
And then substantially similar interconnection. I'm trying to figure out, like, does that necessarily get you like this is the same facility and we're just venue shopping, or is it possible they are designing two similar facilities in two places of the state? Like, is there any, yeah, I don't know. I'm just trying to sort through this requirement and figure out how precise of information is expected to be gotten here.
I'm not sure how precise the information needed would be, but definitely the intent would be to prevent a customer from shopping around and trying to just like get the best deal or whatever. And so once they've made an agreement with one place, then like they drop out of the queue in all the others. And so they're just trying to prevent that from happening on like a widespread basis.
Yeah, I think it's interesting as there's kind of the sense of a lot of this venue shopping, which could be inflating some of the forecasts. So it's interesting, but I'm trying to figure out kind of how precise and actionable it is in that form. And then one more question, I think for me, with regard to the different flavors of having these large load tariffs, having different demand flexibility or demand response kind of capabilities, and if that's economically incentivized or treated in some way, and then the potential for bring your own generation and different ways to interconnect quicker with these sort of considerations. I'm just curious, have those generally been seen as completely discrete regulatory steps in other states? You may or may not know this, but I'm just trying to figure out, or have some of these been packaged in like singular proceedings in these states to kind of deal with these large load issues in total in one proceeding versus kind of discretely dealing with the tariff and then a totally separate demand flexibility assumption and a totally separate, bring your own generation program?
I can start, Liz, and then if you want to follow up, but I think that these are, I don't know that we see like I'm not quite sure if there's necessarily like a flexibility docket or a bring your own generation docket aside maybe from some information gathering. But there are, I think, some examples of utilities tariffs where they include both a flexibility provision and like a bring your own generation provision, all wrapped up in the same tariff. So maybe
Yeah, that's what I was trying to figure out. Like, are these just flavors of large load tariffs where, depending upon your capabilities and your kind of contributions to the generation side of things, the economics or agreement kind of looks different from a tariff basis versus like totally discrete projects or steps?
yeah, they show up, I think, as like different riders on a tariff, for example. Like there's APS has the capacity credit for flexibility. They might have I don't have them all memorized. I wish I did. They might also have a bring your own generation component in APS as well. So yeah, they show up like on the same tariff.
Okay. Yeah, and I didn't expect you to have it all memorized. This is just, trying to figure out how to functionalize this, as we move forward. How do we make this as clear and as streamlined and really like considering the big picture and the different components that could or should be included to make sure we're looking at the situation properly. So excellent. Well, I'll pass back to the chair, but really thank you both for this very helpful analysis.
Hey, yeah, I just had one more question. Is there anything you saw where there were pricing based on locational differences? In the JTS, there seems to be significant value in terms of avoided transmission needs or reducing transmission needs to get the load out of the Denver transmission constrained region. So just wondering if you saw any tariffs with locational issues. Does PJM have different transmission zones or anything you saw that would help with locational pricing?
Yeah. Unfortunately, we did not see much in the way of locational considerations. We did look out for it. And I think the closest thing is maybe, if you recall on the transmission planning slide, ERCOT's regional transmission plan, they do look at different zones and they look at how much large load is coming in a given county. And I'm not quite sure how that all filters through to like wholesale costs in ERCOT of transmission, but there's clearly like locational elements to their transmission planning there. And I don't believe
Can I
we
just
saw.
ask you one question? Can you just see how ERCOT allocates costs, sort of general transmission, incremental transmission costs? So like, is there any impact or incentive to the customer to locate in one zone versus another? So if you could just follow up on that piece, I think that would be really interesting.
Yeah.
And sorry, what? Keep going.
I think I was just going to say we didn't see any locational pricing riders or provisions in tariffs that I can recall right now, at least.
Okay. Well, if you could follow up on the ERCOT transmission cost allocation, that would be great. Any other advice for follow-ups? I know the commissioners are heading into hearing maybe as soon as the end of January on this, so our clock may be closing this out, but any suggestions on follow-up or next steps, or other than the specific things we talked about today?
We could, one other thing that we could take a look at is Ms. Bourget mentioned reporting requirements, and we could see if there's any, in the previous presentation, reporting on interconnection queues was one suggestion. So we could see if there's anything specific that's helpful there. But that's really the only suggestion that I have for now.
Okay. Well, hey, thanks so much. This has been awesome. Commissioner Gilman, any final thoughts?
You know, really a very helpful compilation of this information, and should be very helpful as we move forward on this in the pretty near future here.
Commissioner Plant?
Yeah, definitely helpful. Thanks a lot for all your hard work on this. Appreciate it.
Well, maybe I would suggest that as new materials come in and new tariffs, maybe every, I don't know, 90 days, 60 days, you can just update it. Just keep us up to date on what's going on. It just seems like this field is moving really, really quickly. So would you be willing to do that, Ms. Mulvaney, Ms. Bourget?
Yes, definitely. And that is, I think that is wise given how quickly things move to keep an eye on it.
Yeah, happy to.
Well, just listening to this report, you could just see every major study that's come out over the last 6 months, even the last last couple of weeks made it into this. So thanks again. Let's keep it updated. With that, we're adjourned. Thanks all.